The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered behind the ornate iron gates. Among them stood the Whitmore family from Connecticut, their expensive cameras hanging around their necks like badges of their wealth. James Whitmore, a successful tech entrepreneur, checked his Rolex impatiently while his wife Victoria adjusted her designer sunglasses. Between them stood their 12-year-old son Marcus, fidgeting with the latest iPhone and looking thoroughly unimpressed by the historic surroundings. Marcus had grown up in a world where money solved every problem, and his parents' influence opened every door. Private schools, luxury vacations, and personal tutors had shaped his understanding that rules applied to other people, not to him. His parents had never said no to any of his demands, believing that giving him everything would somehow prepare him for success. Instead, it had created a boy who viewed the world as his personal playground, and other people as obstacles to his entertainment. The family had arrived in London 3 days earlier for what Victoria called their cultural enrichment tour. They had stayed at the most expensive hotels, eaten at Michelin-starred restaurants, and hired private guides for every attraction. But Marcus remained bored and dismissive. The Tower of London was just old stones. Westminster Abbey was creepy and dark, and the British Museum was full of stolen stuff. Nothing seemed to capture his attention or earn his respect. Now, standing before one of the most famous palaces in the world, Marcus was more interested in his phone than the ceremony about to unfold. His parents had paid premium prices for VIP viewing positions, hoping to witness the changing of the guard ceremony that drew millions of visitors each year. The elaborate ritual, steeped in centuries of tradition, represented the dedication and discipline of the Queen's Guard, but to Marcus, it was just another boring adult ceremony. The crowd began to murmur with excitement as the sound of marching feet echoed from the palace grounds. The famous red-coated guards appeared, their tall black bearskin hats creating an impressive silhouette against the morning sky. Their movements were precise and synchronized, each step perfectly timed with their fellow guardsmen. These were not actors or performers, but active soldiers in the British Army, trained in combat and entrusted with protecting the royal family. Among the guards was Sergeant William Chen, a 28-year-old soldier who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before being selected for the prestigious Queen's Guard. His family had immigrated to Britain from Hong Kong when he was young, and he had worked tirelessly to earn his position. The red tunic he wore represented years of training, sacrifice, and unwavering dedication to duty. For William, standing guard at Buckingham Palace was not just a job, but an honor that he carried with deep pride. As the ceremony began, most tourists watched in respectful silence, understanding they were witnessing a tradition that connected the present to centuries of British history. Parents lifted small children onto their shoulders for better views. Elderly visitors leaned forward with obvious appreciation, and tour guides whispered explanations in various languages. The atmosphere was one of reverence and wonder, exactly as it should be for such a significant cultural moment. Marcus, however, remained focused on his phone, occasionally glancing up with obvious disdain. He had grown up in a culture of instant gratification, where entertainment was fast-paced and constantly changing. The slow, methodical movements of the guards seemed pointless to him. He began making quiet comments to his parents about how stupid the ceremony looked and how the guards were just playing dress-up like little kids. His parents, embarrassed by his behavior but unwilling to discipline him publicly, simply shushed him gently and continued watching. They had learned over the years that confronting Marcus about his attitude often led to loud tantrums that drew unwanted attention. It was easier to ignore his comments and hope he would lose interest and quiet down on his own. As the guards took their positions, Marcus noticed how still and serious they remained. Their faces showed no emotion, their eyes focused straight ahead, and their bodies held in perfect military posture. To most observers, this demonstration of discipline and professionalism was impressive and moving. But to Marcus, it looked like an opportunity for entertainment. He had discovered early in life that authority figures who couldn't or wouldn't respond to his provocations made excellent targets for his amusement. The boy began making faces at the guards, sticking out his tongue, and pulling his eyes into silly expressions. When none of them reacted, he became more bold. He started making quiet animal noises, imitating what he thought were British accents in mocking tones, and generally treating the solemn ceremony like his personal comedy show. Other tourists began to notice his behavior, some looking annoyed while others seemed uncomfortable with the disrespect being shown. Sergeant Chen could see the boy's antics from his peripheral vision, but remained focused on his duties. Years of military training had taught him to ignore distractions and maintain his professional composure, regardless of circumstances. He had dealt with difficult situations in combat zones, and a rude child was certainly not going to break his concentration or compromise his performance. But Marcus misinterpreted the guard's lack of response as weakness rather than strength. In his limited experience, people who didn't react to his provocations were either afraid of him or too stupid to understand what he was doing. The idea that someone might be choosing to ignore him out of professionalism and duty was completely foreign to his understanding of how the world worked. As the ceremony continued, Marcus grew more frustrated with his inability to get a reaction. The guards remained perfectly still and focused, their dedication to their duty unwavering despite his increasingly obvious attempts to distract them. This only made him more determined to find a way to break through their professional facade and get the attention and reaction he felt he deserved. The ceremony progressed with its traditional precision, but Marcus's behavior escalated with each passing minute. What had started as silly faces and quiet mockery began to transform into something more disruptive and disrespectful. He pulled out his phone and began taking selfies with exaggerated expressions, making sure the guards were visible in the background. His parents noticed but continued to avoid addressing his behavior, hoping it would simply run its course without creating a scene. Marcus had never learned the concept of appropriate boundaries or social respect. Throughout his life, his parents had treated his rudeness as personality and his disrespect as confidence. Teachers at his exclusive private school rarely challenged him because of his family's substantial donations. Service workers in restaurants and hotels smiled through his demands because of the generous tips his parents provided. In Marcus's world, money had always insulated him from the consequences of his actions. The other tourists began to take notice of the boy's increasingly inappropriate behavior. An elderly British gentleman wearing a military veteran's pin looked particularly disturbed by the display. His own grandson was serving in the army, and he understood the dedication and sacrifice required to earn a position in the Queen's Guard. A young mother from Australia quietly moved her children away from Marcus, not wanting them to witness or potentially copy his disrespectful actions. Sergeant Chen maintained his professional composure despite the growing disturbance. His training had prepared him for many challenges, from combat situations to dealing with difficult crowds. However, the blatant disrespect being shown to the institution he served and the ceremony he was part of tested even his considerable patience. The Queen's Guard represented centuries of British military tradition, and every soldier who wore the uniform understood the weight of that responsibility. Marcus noticed that some adults were starting to watch him instead of the ceremony, which only encouraged his behavior further. In his mind, any attention was good attention, and he had successfully made himself the center of focus rather than the boring guards. He began speaking louder, making jokes about the guards' uniforms and questioning why they needed such stupid hats. His voice carried across the courtyard, disrupting the solemn atmosphere that the ceremony was meant to create. Victoria Whitmore finally felt compelled to respond to her son's behavior, but her approach lacked any real authority. "Marcus, honey, maybe you should lower your voice a little," she suggested gently, more concerned about the other tourists' opinions than about teaching her son respect. James remained focused on his camera, occasionally telling Marcus to come look at this in an attempt to redirect his attention without actually addressing the inappropriate behavior. The boy's antics reached a new level when he began imitating the guard's posture in an exaggerated, mocking way. He stood rigidly straight, puffed out his chest, and marched around in small circles while making what he thought were military commands in a fake accent. Other children in the crowd watched with fascination, some beginning to giggle at his performance. which only fueled his determination to continue. A security officer stationed near the gates noticed the disturbance and began moving closer to the family. These officers were trained to identify potential problems before they escalated, and Marcus's behavior was clearly disrupting the experience for other visitors. The officer had dealt with similar situations before, usually involving tourists, who didn't understand the significance of the ceremony or the need for respectful behavior. But Marcus was too focused on his performance to notice the approaching authority figure. He had discovered that he could make other children laugh, which felt like victory in his ongoing battle for attention. He began adding sound effects to his marching routine, making exaggerated hup 2, 3, 4 sounds while saluting in different directions. The respectful silence that had characterized the ceremony was being replaced by giggles and murmurs from the crowd. Sergeant Chen could hear every word and sound coming from the disruptive boy, but his military training kept him focused on his duties. Years of service had taught him that reacting to provocations only encouraged further bad behavior. He had seen fellow soldiers lose their composure in difficult situations, and he understood that maintaining professionalism was crucial, not just for his own reputation, but for the honor of the entire unit. The ceremony was approaching its climax, with the guards preparing to perform their final movements and take their assigned positions. This was typically the most impressive part of the entire ritual, when the precision and dedication of the Queen's Guard was most clearly displayed. But Marcus seemed determined to ensure that his antics overshadowed this meaningful moment. He began throwing small objects toward the guards, starting with pieces of paper from his pocket. When these failed to get a reaction, he escalated to small coins from his father's wallet. The metallic sounds as they hit the ground near the guards' feet created an obvious disturbance, but still the soldiers maintained their professional composure. Their ability to remain focused despite such provocations demonstrated the strength of their training and character. Other tourists began to look openly annoyed and uncomfortable with the family's failure to control their child. A tour guide from Germany quietly approached James Whitmore and suggested that he might want to address his son's behavior before it escalated further. But James, like his wife, seemed more embarrassed than concerned, offering weak apologies while failing to take any meaningful action to stop Marcus. The security officer finally reached the family's location and positioned himself where he could observe Marcus more closely. His presence represented the first real consequence the boy might face for his actions, but Marcus remained oblivious to the potential seriousness of his behavior. In his sheltered world, authority figures were either friendly helpers who catered to his needs or temporary obstacles that his parents' influence could easily remove. As the ceremony neared its conclusion, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He had grown frustrated with his inability to get any reaction from the impressively disciplined guards, and his 12-year-old mind began searching for something more dramatic that would finally break through their professional facade and give him the attention and reaction he felt he deserved from these boring adults in stupid costumes. The moment that would define the entire encounter began when Marcus spotted a small opening in the ceremonial barriers that separated tourists from the guards. The barriers were designed more for organization than security, creating clear sight lines for visitors while maintaining appropriate distance from the active military ceremony. But to Marcus, they represented just another rule that didn't apply to him, another boundary that existed for other people to follow. His parents were momentarily distracted, James adjusting his camera settings for better photos while Victoria checked her phone for messages from friends back home. This brief lack of supervision was all Marcus needed to slip away from their side and move closer to the guards. His heart raced with excitement at his own boldness, convinced that he was about to achieve something spectacular that would finally get the reaction he had been seeking. The security officer who had been watching the family noticed Marcus's movement immediately and began walking more quickly in his direction. Years of experience had taught him to recognize when a situation was about to escalate from mere disruption to actual interference with official proceedings. He called out to the boy in a firm but professional voice, "Young man, please return to your family immediately." But Marcus had learned to ignore authority figures who couldn't immediately force compliance. At school, He had discovered that teachers often made demands they couldn't or wouldn't enforce, especially when dealing with students from wealthy, influential families. He assumed this security officer was just another adult making empty threats, so he continued moving toward the guards with determined purpose. Sergeant Chen noticed the approaching child in his peripheral vision, but maintained his position and focus. Military protocol was clear about how guards should respond to civilian interference, and years of training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation. He knew that breaking formation or reacting emotionally would compromise not just his own professionalism but the integrity of the entire ceremony. The other guards were equally aware of the developing situation. Through subtle eye movements and barely perceptible shifts in posture, they communicated their readiness to respond if necessary. These men had served together in various capacities, some in combat zones where split-second coordination could mean the difference between life and death. Dealing with one disruptive child was certainly within their capabilities, but they hoped the situation would resolve itself before any intervention became necessary. Marcus reached the edge of the ceremonial area and paused for a moment, suddenly, aware that he had crossed into territory where the rules might actually apply to him. The guards seemed much larger and more imposing up close, their uniforms and equipment clearly indicating their serious professional nature. For a brief moment his confidence wavered as he realized he was no longer safely hidden among the crowd of tourists. But his need for attention and his ingrained belief that consequences didn't apply to him overcame any momentary doubt. He had come this far in his quest to disrupt the ceremony, and turning back now felt like admitting defeat. In his 12-year-old mind, he had invested too much effort in this performance to abandon it without achieving his goal of getting a reaction. From these stubbornly professional soldiers, the crowd of tourists had begun to notice that something unusual was happening. Conversations quieted and cameras turned away from the official ceremony to focus on the unfolding drama. Parents pulled their children closer, sensing that they were about to witness something that would serve as either entertainment or a cautionary tale, depending on how events developed. Victoria Whitmore finally looked up from her phone and immediately spotted her son approaching the guards. Her first reaction was not concern for the appropriateness of his behavior, but fear about how this might reflect on their family's reputation. "James," she whispered urgently, "Marcus is—" But before she could finish the sentence, events began, unfolding too quickly for parental intervention. Marcus took his final steps into the ceremonial area and found himself standing directly in front of Sergeant Chen. The height difference was dramatic, with the soldier's bearskin hat adding even more imposing presence to his already impressive stature. For a moment, Marcus felt genuinely small and uncertain, his usual confidence shaken by the reality of confronting someone who radiated authentic authority and discipline. But rather than retreating, Marcus decided to escalate his behavior to its ultimate level. He reached out and deliberately touched the guard's pristine red tunic, leaving a small handprint on the immaculate uniform. The gesture was clearly intentional and disrespectful, designed to force some kind of reaction from the stoically professional soldier. The effect was immediate and dramatic, not because Sergeant Chen broke his discipline or abandoned his post, but because Marcus had crossed a line that transformed his behavior from mere rudeness into actual interference with official, military duties. The touching of a guard's uniform during ceremony constituted a violation that required official response according to established protocols. The security officer reached Marcus within seconds, his professional demeanor now replaced with the firm authority of someone addressing a serious breach of conduct. Other tourists began stepping back, sensing that the situation had moved beyond simple misbehavior into something with real consequences. The atmosphere in the courtyard shifted from tolerant amusement to tense anticipation. Marcus looked back toward his parents, expecting to see them rushing to his defense as they always did when he got into trouble. But for the first time in his life, he saw something different in their expressions. Instead of protective anger directed at whoever was threatening their precious son, he saw embarrassment, disappointment, and the dawning realization that their failure to teach him appropriate behavior had led to this very public humiliation. The moment stretched on as everyone waited to see how this unprecedented situation would resolve itself. Marcus had successfully gotten the attention he craved, but perhaps not in the way he had anticipated. The guards maintained their professional composure, the security officer prepared to address the violation, and the crowd of international tourists watched with fascination as consequences finally caught up with a spoiled child who had never learned that some boundaries were not meant to be crossed. What happened next would remain etched in the memories of everyone present for years to come. Sergeant Chen, maintaining the perfect composure that had defined his military career, did something that perfectly exemplified the discipline and humanity that made the Queen's Guard so respected worldwide. Rather than shouting or making any sudden movements that might frighten the child, he slowly and deliberately turned his head to look directly down at Marcus. The sergeant's eyes met those of the 12-year-old boy, and in that moment, Marcus experienced something completely foreign to his sheltered existence. He was looking into the eyes of someone who had seen real hardship, who had served his country in dangerous places, who had earned his position through dedication and sacrifice rather than privilege and wealth. There was no anger in those eyes, no hatred or desire for revenge, just a profound sadness mixed with disappointment. Without breaking eye contact or raising his voice, Sergeant Chen spoke in a tone that was both gentle and unmistakably firm. "Young man," he said with his slight accent, "this uniform represents something far greater than you might understand. It represents service, sacrifice, and respect for traditions that have protected this nation for centuries. Every soldier who wears it has earned that right through dedication and honor." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, not because they were harsh or threatening, but because they were delivered with such quiet dignity and genuine sadness. For the first time in his life, he was face to face with someone who wasn't trying to please him, punish him, or use him for their own purposes. Here was an adult who was simply telling him the truth about his behavior and its impact on others. The crowd had fallen completely silent, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. This was not the angry confrontation that Marcus's behavior had seemed to invite, nor was it the weak capitulation that his parents typically offered when he misbehaved. Instead, it was a masterclass in how authentic authority and genuine character could address poor behavior without descending to its level. Marcus felt his face growing hot with an emotion he rarely experienced: genuine shame. Not the embarrassment he felt when caught breaking rules, not the frustration of being denied something he wanted, but actual shame at having disappointed someone who clearly deserved better treatment. The guard's quiet dignity made Marcus's behavior appear even more childish and inappropriate by contrast. Sergeant Chen continued, his voice never wavering from its respectful but firm tone. "My fellow guards and I stand here not because we have to, but because we choose to serve something larger than ourselves. We represent the dedication of every man and woman who has worn this uniform, including those who gave their lives protecting the freedoms that allow you to visit this place safely today." The security officer had reached them but stood back slightly, recognizing that something important was happening that shouldn't be interrupted. He had seen many confrontations between guards and disruptive visitors, but never one handled with such perfect balance of firmness and compassion. This was clearly a teaching moment that might have more impact than any punishment or removal from the premises. James and Victoria Whitmore finally arrived at the scene, their faces flushed with embarrassment and something approaching panic. They had spent years shielding Marcus from any real consequences for his actions, and now they were helpless to protect him from the natural results of his behavior. For the first time, they were seeing their son through the eyes of others, and the view was not flattering. "We are so sorry," Victoria began, her voice shaking with mortification. "He's usually not like this. He's just excited to be here and But her words trailed off as she realized how hollow they sounded. The truth was that Marcus was exactly like this, and their failure to address his behavior had led directly to this moment of public humiliation. Sergeant Chen shifted his attention briefly to the parents, his expression showing the same gentle disappointment he had shown their son. "Your child is clearly intelligent and capable," he said quietly. "But intelligence without respect and capability without discipline can lead to great harm. Today's lesson could be a gift if it's received with an open heart." The guard then did something that surprised everyone present. He slowly removed one, of his white gloves and extended his hand toward Marcus. "My name is William," he said, abandoning the formal protocol that normally governed his interactions with civilians. "I would be honored to shake the hand of someone who I hope will grow up to serve others, rather than demanding to be served." Marcus stared at the extended hand as if it were a foreign object. Throughout his life, adults had either demanded things from him or given him things, but never had one offered him respect while simultaneously challenging him to be better. The handshake wasn't a reward for his behavior, but an invitation to rise above it, to become someone worthy of the respect being offered. Slowly, hesitantly, Marcus extended his own hand and felt it enveloped in the firm, calloused grip of someone who had earned his authority through service rather than inheritance. The handshake lasted only a few seconds, but in those moments, something fundamental shifted in the boy's understanding of what it meant to be a person of character and dignity. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered, the words barely audible but carrying more sincerity than he had ever managed in his 12 years of life. "I didn't understand. I was being stupid and mean, and you didn't deserve that." The apology wasn't motivated by fear of punishment or desire to avoid consequences, but by genuine recognition that his behavior had been wrong. Sergeant Chen nodded gravely, accepting the apology with the same dignity he had shown throughout the entire encounter. "Understanding is the first step toward wisdom," he replied, "and wisdom is the foundation of true strength. I believe you have the potential for both, but that choice belongs to you alone." The transformation in Marcus was visible to everyone watching. The cocky, disrespectful child who had entered the ceremonial area had been replaced by someone who looked genuinely thoughtful and subdued. He stepped back from Sergeant Chen, but didn't immediately return to his parents, instead remaining where he could continue to observe the guard and process what had just occurred. The ceremony resumed with the same precision and dignity that had characterized it before the interruption. But now it held new meaning for Marcus. He watched as Sergeant Chen returned to his position with seamless professionalism, showing no sign that the encounter had disrupted his focus or commitment to duty. The other guards had witnessed the entire exchange, but maintained their own positions without judgment or distraction. For the first time since arriving in London, Marcus found himself genuinely interested in what he was seeing. The guards' movements weren't boring displays of stubbornness, but demonstrations of discipline and mutual respect. Their silence wasn't emptiness, but strength. Their commitment to maintaining their posts regardless of distractions wasn't foolishness, but dedication to something larger than their individual comfort or convenience. The crowd of tourists had also been affected by what they had witnessed. Many had pulled out their phones during Marcus's disruptive behavior, expecting to capture some dramatic confrontation or security incident for their social media accounts. Instead, they had recorded something far more valuable, a master class in how character and dignity could transform conflict into understanding. An elderly veteran approached the Whitmore family as the ceremony concluded. He had served in the Royal Navy decades earlier and understood better than most civilians the significance of what Sergeant Chen had done. "Your son just received a gift more valuable than anything money could buy," he told James and Victoria quietly. That soldier showed him what it means to be a man of honor. The veteran's words hit both parents with unexpected force. They had spent 12 years providing their son with every material advantage imaginable, believing that wealth and privilege would prepare him for success. But in 5 minutes, a young sergeant had given Marcus something they had never been able to offer: an example of genuine character and the challenge to become someone worthy of respect, rather than simply demanding it. Marcus remained quiet during the walk back to their hotel, his mind processing the encounter in ways that surprised him. He kept thinking about Sergeant Chen's eyes and the sadness they had contained. Not anger at Marcus's behavior, but genuine disappointment that someone so young had already learned to treat others with disrespect. The guard had seen potential in Marcus that the boy had never recognized in himself. That evening at dinner, the family sat in unusual silence. Typically, Marcus dominated conversations with complaints about the day's activities or demands for the next day's entertainment. But tonight he seemed lost in thought, occasionally asking quiet questions about the guards, their training, and what it meant to serve in the military. Victoria found herself looking at her son with new eyes, recognizing for the first time how their indulgence had prevented him from developing the character traits she had always assumed would emerge naturally. They had given him everything except the opportunity to earn anything, to struggle for something worth having, or to develop the inner strength that came from overcoming challenges. James, too, was experiencing an uncomfortable revelation about his parenting. He had built a successful technology company through determination, innovation, and hard work, but he had shielded Marcus from ever having to develop those same qualities. In trying to give his son an easier life than he had experienced, he had inadvertently robbed him of the opportunity to build character through adversity. The next morning brought another surprise. Marcus woke early and asked if they could return to Buckingham Palace to watch the ceremony again. His parents, expecting another day of complaints and disruptions, were puzzled by this request, but agreed to include it in their itinerary. When they arrived at the palace, Marcus positioned himself in the crowd with obvious respect for the barriers and protocols. He watched the entire ceremony in complete silence, his attention focused entirely on the guards and their demonstration of discipline and professionalism. When it concluded, he asked his parents if they could wait nearby for a few more minutes. To their amazement, Marcus approached the security officer who had witnessed the previous day's incident. With obvious nervousness but genuine determination, he asked if there was any way he could speak with Sergeant Chen again, not to cause trouble but to thank him properly for the lesson he had received. The security officer, who had been impressed by the way the situation had been handled, made a few inquiries and discovered that Sergeant Chen would be available for a brief conversation during his break period. When the guard appeared, still in his impressive uniform but now off duty, Marcus approached him with visible respect and gratitude. "Sergeant Chen," Marcus began formally, having learned the proper way to address a military person from internet research the previous evening. "I wanted to thank you for yesterday. I've been thinking about what you said and I realize I was acting like someone I don't want to be anymore." The sergeant smiled, the first time Marcus had seen any emotion other than professional composure on his face. "That shows wisdom beyond your years," William replied. "Growth requires the courage to acknowledge when we need to change, and that's not always easy at any age." Marcus then did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He asked Sergeant Chen about his service, his training, and what had motivated him to join the military. The conversation that followed was unlike any the 12-year-old had ever experienced, focused not on what he wanted, but on learning about someone else's experiences and perspectives. When they finally parted, Marcus walked back to his parents, with a sense of purpose they had never seen in him before. The encounter had planted seeds of understanding about service, respect, and the difference between demanding attention and earning admiration. The spoiled child who had taunted a royal guard was beginning to transform into someone capable of genuine growth and character development. The remainder of the Whitmore family's London vacation unfolded in ways none of them had anticipated. Marcus, who had previously shown little interest in any of the cultural and historical sites his parents had carefully planned, suddenly became an engaged and curious traveler. He asked thoughtful questions at the Imperial War Museum, listened attentively to guides at historical sites, and showed genuine respect for the people and places they encountered. The change was so dramatic that James and Victoria found themselves struggling to understand their son's transformation. The boy who had complained about everything was now expressing gratitude for opportunities to learn. The child who had demanded constant entertainment was now content to spend time quietly, observing and reflecting. Most surprisingly, the young person who had always insisted on being the center of attention was now showing genuine interest in other people's stories and experiences. When they returned to their hotel each evening, Marcus would spend time researching the places they had visited and the historical figures they had learned about. He discovered stories of ordinary people who had done extraordinary things through service, sacrifice, and dedication to principles larger than themselves. These stories resonated with him in ways that his previous interests in video games and social media never had. His parents watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and concern. They were pleased to see Marcus developing interests beyond material possessions and immediate gratification, but they also recognized that his growth was highlighting their own failures as parents. The encounter with Sergeant Chen had accomplished in minutes what 12 years of expensive education and countless privileges had failed to achieve. On their final day in London, Marcus made an unexpected request. He asked if they could visit a charity that supported military veterans, explaining that he wanted to volunteer some of his time before returning to America. His parents, still adjusting to this new version of their son, agreed to help him find an appropriate organization. At the Veterans Charity, Marcus met former soldiers who had faced various challenges after their military service. Some struggled with physical injuries sustained in combat. Others dealt with the psychological effects of their experiences, and many simply needed help transitioning from military to civilian life. These men and women had given years of their lives in service to their country, and now they needed support from the communities they had protected. Marcus spent the afternoon helping serve meals, listening to stories, and learning about the real costs of the service and sacrifice that Sergeant Chen had spoken about. He met a former paratrooper who had lost his leg in Afghanistan but maintained an optimistic outlook on life. He talked with a Navy veteran who struggled with nightmares, but dedicated her days to helping other veterans adjust to civilian life. These conversations deepened Marcus's understanding of what Sergeant Chen had been trying to teach him. Service wasn't just about wearing a uniform or standing guard at ceremonial events. It was about placing the welfare of others before your own comfort, contributing to something meaningful rather than simply taking from the world around you, and finding purpose through helping rather than being helped. That evening, as the family prepared to return to America, Marcus had a serious conversation with his parents about the changes he wanted to make in his life. He acknowledged that his previous behavior had been selfish and disrespectful, not just toward Sergeant Chen, but toward many people who had tried to help him grow into a better person. James and Victoria listened to their son's reflections with growing understanding of their own role in his previous behavior. They had believed that protecting him from consequences and providing him with endless privileges would somehow prepare him for success. Instead, they had prevented him from developing the character traits that would actually serve him well in life. The flight home provided time for the entire family to discuss how they would approach things differently. Marcus expressed interest in earning his privileges rather than simply receiving them, contributing to their community rather than just consuming its resources, and learning about service and sacrifice rather than assuming the world existed for his entertainment. Back in Connecticut, Marcus's transformation continued and deepened. He researched local volunteer opportunities and began spending weekends helping at a food bank that served struggling families. He approached his studies with new seriousness, not because his parents demanded it, but because he had discovered the satisfaction of learning and growing. Perhaps most significantly, Marcus began treating the people around him with the respect and dignity that Sergeant Chen had modeled during their encounter. He thanked his teachers, showed appreciation for service workers, and developed genuine friendships based on mutual respect rather than his family's social status. His parents also made changes, recognizing that their son's growth required them to step back from their protective role and allow him to face appropriate challenges and consequences. They established clear expectations for his behavior, required him to earn privileges through responsible actions, and supported his interest in service activities. 6 months after their return from London, Marcus received a letter that would become one of his most treasured possessions. Sergeant Chen, who had been moved to a different assignment, had taken time to write a personal note acknowledging Marcus's continued growth and expressing hope for his future contributions to the world. The letter concluded with words that Marcus would carry with him for the rest of his life. True strength comes not from demanding respect, but from earning it through service to others. The boy I met at Buckingham Palace had great potential, but the young man you are becoming has something far more valuable. Character built through conscious choice and daily commitment to being better than yesterday. Marcus framed the letter and placed it on his desk where he could see it every day while doing homework or planning his volunteer activities. The words served as a constant reminder of the person he was choosing to become, rather than the person he had been raised to be through privilege and indulgence. 2 years later, Marcus started a program at his school that paired students with local veterans, providing companionship and assistance with daily tasks. The program, inspired by his experience at the London Veterans Charity, became one of the most successful community service initiatives in the school's history. Students who participated reported that they gained far more from the experience than they gave, learning about resilience, sacrifice, and finding meaning through service to others. His parents watched his continued growth with amazement and gratitude. The spoiled, demanding child who had embarrassed them at Buckingham Palace had evolved into a thoughtful, contributing member of society who took pride in helping others rather than being helped. They often reflected on how close they had come to raising someone who would have spent his life taking from the world rather than adding to it. The encounter that had lasted only a few minutes had set in motion changes that would influence Marcus's entire future. He eventually chose to attend a university known for its strong public service programs, majoring in international relations with a focus on veteran affairs. His goal was to work with organizations that supported military personnel and their families, carrying forward the lessons he had learned from Sergeant Chen. Years later, when Marcus became a father himself, he would tell his children about the day he learned the difference between demanding respect and earning it. He would explain how one soldier's dignity and compassion had shown him what it truly meant to be strong, and how that lesson had changed the entire trajectory of his life. The story became a family legend, passed down not as entertainment, but as a teaching tool about character, growth, and the power of treating others with dignity, even when they haven't earned it. Marcus would always credit Sergeant Chen with saving him from a life of selfishness and entitlement, showing him instead the path to genuine fulfillment through service and respect for others. In a world where consequences for bad behavior were often delayed or avoided entirely, the immediate and compassionate response of one professional soldier had accomplished what years of privilege and protection could never achieve. The spoiled child who had taunted a royal guard had faced not punishment, but an invitation to become someone worthy of the respect he had demanded, and that invitation had transformed not just Marcus, but his entire family's understanding of what it meant to live a meaningful life.